Good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody who's joining from wherever you're joining. My name is Elisa Scalise. I'm the Executive Director of Resource Equity. And we are pleased to be able to share with you this panel of very interesting and I think important research today. Resource Equity is a global nonprofit whose mission is to advance the land tenure security of women all over the world. And as an organisation, we're focused on evidence that supports action. So not just understanding issues, but understanding and learning how to address those issues to make meaningful change in women's lives. Essentially, we're interested in evidence that answers the question, what works to improve women's land and property rights? And to this end, we've supported research from practitioners and researchers to look at a specific intervention and answer the question of whether it was effective at improving women's land tenure security. Today, we're pleased to be showcasing 3 of the 5 studies that we supported in our most recent grant round. All the studies can be found on the website, and the address, as Kirsten mentioned, for each of them is in the chat as well, which provides a bit of a synopsis. The research that we'll hear about today covers very different cultural, social and legal contexts and very different land tenure systems in Sierra Leone, Kyrgyzstan and Kenya, and they each assess very different interventions to address the challenges that women face. Yet despite these differences, you may see that there's a common thread through all of them in the experience of women when it comes to land tenure. And because of this common thread, the research presented today, we believe, helps shed light on what can be done to address insecurity that women face with regard to land tenure, not just in Sierra Leone, Kyrgyzstan and Kenya, but around the world. We welcome our panelists today to share the findings from their research, and then we'll be opening up at the end for questions from all of you, and hopefully we'll be able to get to most of them today. As my colleague Kirsten mentioned, just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and will be shared along with the other materials at the end of the session. And if anybody is interested in getting contacts from the researchers or any of us, please feel free to reach out. With that, let me give the floor to our first panelist today. Kirsten, if you want to put up the slides. Our first panelist is, we've got the view, the open view. Kirsten, sorry, not the screen view. Right. Okay. All right, while we're waiting for the slides to come up. Our first panelist today is Yannick Wild from an organisation called Green Scenery in Sierra Leone. His bio and information will be coming up in just a minute on the screen, shared screen. Yannick's going to be speaking about looking at an intervention that was working on an area of customary tenure and specifically looking at reforms around village land committees and women in Sierra Leone. And I'll hand it over to you now, Yannick, to share with us the findings from your research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa. So we'll quickly wait for the presentation to come.
Sorry about that. Having a little problem with my screen share at the minute. How is that?
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much. Like Elisa said, I'm working in Sierra Leone with an organization called Green Scenery, and we made a research, if you can go to the next slide, which was especially looking at an intervention from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization in Sierra Leone, which aimed at promoting women's customary land rights, women's land tenure right, through the promotion of their customary land rights. So I'll explain what this is. If you can go to the next slide, please. Well, let me start a little bit at the basics. Sorry, I will just take a minute to explain a bit the land tenure system in Sierra Leone. To give you background, I was asked not to take too much time, but just quickly, because I think it's not one of the most famous countries. So land in Sierra Leone is owned by lineage families. Big families of 50, 100 members, sometimes more, will own big chunks of land together. You might have in a village 3 to 5 of those lineage family, and they are headed by a family head, often also by a council of elders, which will make decisions regarding those land, which will allocate those land to household family. So when we talk about household family, it's a husband and wife owning the land together. So the lineage family will allocate those land to different plots to those household families. Most of the land is governed by customary law. So there is a statutory law, there is a Western style law, but most communities will not really follow these kind of laws, but have their own customary law. I just made a quick example of a tenure rights, because you might have very different actors having different interests to the same plot of land. It's not our or my understanding of the understanding of a really a Western styled ownership, individual ownership of land. So you might have the whole community having right to access to a plot of land. The right to withdrawal, to take resources, might be given only to the household family, subjected to the head of family or the traditional leader also making decisions there. The right to manage, that is to plant or to cut trees, will also be given to the household family, which is managing this plot of land. But also subject to the head of family having to ask him or her if they can cut trees, if they can build a house, and also subject to the decision of the traditional leader. And the right to exclude people from the property would be also given to the household family, again, subject to the family head and to the traditional leader. When you look at the higher rights, the right to make money from the lands, when you are leasing the land, that will be excluding, that will be only to the whole family, and the money would be distributed among members of family, especially the family head. And the right to lease the land would be again given to the family head, which is holding the land on behalf of the whole family with the agreement of a traditional leader. So just to show you how tenure rights could work in Sierra Leone, this is one example, but it could be actually different. It depends from family to family and to community, but usually it is following this schema. Yes, please, next slide. So what are the barriers to women tenure rights in this system? The allocation of plots is usually the issue, because like I said, you will have the landowning family, especially the family head and the elders, making decision to whom they will give a plot of land of their family. And that would mostly be to men, because men are expected to provide for their future wife and for their children and to give them access to land. And women are expected to marry somebody outside of their community, or at least outside of their family, and to have access through their husbands and not through their own family. So this is where the biggest problem is, that women will not be allocated for plots of household land in the first instance. That also has consequences, because women will not be regarded as belonging to this new land owning family where they just married in. So they will not take part in meetings where decisions are made. Sometimes those decisions are not only made by the family head, but by a consultant, a meeting of the whole family members. So women might not participate, that have been married into the family might not participate in those meetings. And they might also not inherit the land when their husband dies. So this is also one of the issue, but we also have seen practices such as women inheritance, that women have to marry the brother of their husband to continue to have access to lands, etc. So inheritance conditions are still there. Also, they need to have children with their husband to continue to have access, often through their children. And of course, the issue of divorce is still a very big issue. When women divorce, they will most of the time not keep access to their land, except their husband is generous. Please, next slide. So what are we looking at? We're looking at an intervention from the FAO 2017-2020, which was really aiming at promoting the customary land rights of women, because like I said, there are laws, but they are not really being followed in those communities. So how to promote the customary land rights of women. So the intervention was aiming at 4 things. First was livelihood support, to give women access to agricultural material, especially seeds and tools, so that they will plant on their own land, increasing their economic power, increasing also their legitimacy to a plot of land. If they have planted there, if they are harvesting, they will have more legitimacy to those plots. And there was a lot of awareness, especially to the official laws. What are the official laws? What are women allowed to inherit, etc. So this was also a big part of the project. And then a part was the mapping. So the mapping was to map all the land of the land owning families, to demarcate the boundaries, but also of the household, of the single household, who has which land, and then to put that in a digital system, to print maps that were distributed to the community, especially to the traditional leaders. And then the core of the project was local land governance, the creation of committees which would take care of the community land and which also make decisions around land. So those committees would replace the traditional role of the leaders, the town chief, the village chiefs, which would have a lot of tasks around land, to solve conflict, to collect taxes, to make decisions around land in general. So those committees would take over those tasks, and those committees would be made of 25 people. Half of them are women. And this is an idea of democratizing those decisions around land issues, and especially to bring women into the decision making, in the hope, of course, that having women participating, there might be more equity in the decisions being made. Yes, please. Next slide. So what was the idea? The idea is to translate, one part of the idea was to translate laws, the official laws, into customs, or into customary laws, because the awareness that the women and the community people would get, what are actually the laws at the national level, why does it make sense, why should we promote the rights of women to land, because it has a lot of benefits, less conflict, but also more economic benefits. So the idea was to translate those laws through those committees into customs, into customary law that will be enforced by the traditional leader. And to also at the same time change the roots of those customs. Because why would land be more allocated to men? Because, as I said, they are expected to provide for their wife, for their children. They are expected to have the control of the resources. But by changing that, giving the resources, giving the agricultural power to women, we would change the roots of those customs to have women be more economically empowered and have more access to land, more control over land. And then the last step was to promote the customary rights that are already existing, to promote women. Like I said, consultation, where women would participate in those consultations to promote those ideas, and also to promote the control of women over land, because in Sierra Leone, women are making the biggest part of the job of planting, of harvesting, etc. So to promote also this aspect, to have them have even more control over land. Yes, please. What did we do? So we went to 2 communities where the project was implemented, 2 beneficiary communities, and we made 50 in-depth interviews with the women landowner, but also further interview with the stakeholder, with the chief, women leader, etc. from the community. Next slide, please. So what did we find out? We found out that there has been a big realization from everybody in the community, be it men or women, that women have been strongly marginalized, that women have been treated very unfairly in regard to land. So through all those awareness trainings, those people have really understood, especially the women, that they were treated unfairly, and they have had more confidence to question all those practices that have been happening that marginalize them. Like I said, those women inheritance, and the women really said those practices reduced or completely ceased to exist in those communities. No women were sent away from their communities. The inheritance right increased. So really this understanding that they have been treated well and that they will ask for their rights to be enforced. And we saw that through many different statements. For example, one woman landowner in Rosin said that the wickedness from men to women, it's a famous word in Sierra Leone in the Creole language, the wickedness from men to women reduced by creating fear in men to handle their women badly. They would fear consequences if they don't allow women access to use or inherit lands. So of course, it's not the idea to create any fear in anybody, but it's interesting to see that the men have recognized that there might be consequences if they don't give access to women to land, they don't let them inherit land. There might be consequences at the official law level, at the legal level, but maybe also at the customary level. So those are the things that we've seen. Please, next slide. So the most important part of the project, like I said, were those committees. And we have seen that those committees, they have adopted new bylaws to protect women land rights. For example, one bylaw that was adopted by several committees was that women and men, or boys and girls, should be treated as equals in regard to land. They should have equal access to land. And everybody in the community would know those bylaws and would know that they have been newly enacted. So we saw that those committees took those responsibilities seriously, but at the same time, we also saw that there was a lot of confusion around those new customary bylaws. For example, if we asked people what about inheritance, women would get, some people would say that women would get 40% and the family would get 60%. Some people would say it depends if they have children. Some other people would say they would get 100%. So we saw that there is a paradigm shift, that there is a change in what are the customary rights that are valid in those communities, but that still people are not sure which one it is, because those laws are unwritten and because it's changing slowly. There was a lot of confusion around what is actually valid right now, and everybody would have a different understanding because probably the change was too quick. Was the idea to enforce those new bylaws, those new customary laws, but it was very quick. One other thing that we saw also, we went back recently also to those villages and asked the committees, they have really taken the issue of preventing conflict very seriously. So this is also something that we hope will have an effect. We haven't really seen too many conflicts. Sorry? Okay. So we haven't seen that many conflicts yet, how they were resolved, but we really hope that because women are part of those land committees, that something will happen. Yes, sorry, I'm taking too much time. So I'm coming to the mapping. No, go on, go to the mapping. That's fine. So the mapping was something that we weren't sure at the beginning of our research, because in the literature, you have a lot of questions around that, if that's really beneficial to women, because putting the land, the title, a collective title, into the hand of one person, especially a head of family, which is most often a man. In all the communities that we worked in, it's a man. That was a bit questionable, but still, we saw that it has, most women that we interviewed said it was very good for them, because before this boundary clarification, men would claim their land. They would come to their land and say, and cut trees or collect cash crops, or even start planting, saying that this is actually their land. They would claim it based on an ancestor or something else. And because they had more power in those communities, they would be able to claim those land. And that would not happen anymore after the mapping, after the boundary clarification, because everybody in the community, also the women, would know exactly where their lands are at. And again, we saw a strong conflict reduction, because most conflicts in Sierra Leone that are in courts are land conflicts. And if you clarify the boundaries, well, of course, it's more simple to solve. Yes, please. Okay, to conclude, all women that we interviewed claimed that there was an apparent improvement in their land rights, especially regarding those practices such as women inheritance, like I said, being married to a brother of their husband after he is deceased, or being sent back to their biological families. Those were practices that completely stopped after the project because they really understand that that was an unfair treatment of women. And we also saw that women received plots of land on their own, being from their husband on the household plot of land to manage for themselves, to reap the benefit of the harvest, or be it at the family level where they would be allocated from the head of family a plot of land, or even in one of the village, they created the women association receiving land, community land to manage on their own. And we still see that the biggest problem is not resolved. The allocation of land is still rather to sons upon marriage, to boys. Boys would get a bigger share of the land. So this is where we really need to look at how to change this practice, especially this idea that it is really the man that should provide the land for the women, that the women will only have access through their husband, through their father, through their husband. So how to change this allocation, that will take a lot of time. Something that we saw also is the gender division of labor. What I mean with that is that specific tasks are often reserved to men. For example, cutting trees or building dwellings are still very much 100% reserved to men in the community that we looked at. And those are the tasks that give the people a more legitimate claim to the land. If there are cash crop trees, cashew nuts, or if you have mango trees on your land, which are providing and bringing money to your family, then you have a higher claim to the land. If you have built a house, you might have a higher claim to this land. So that those tasks are still reserved for men. Women would never plant trees or cut trees. That makes also their claim to land less legitimate. And this is where we could start addressing the issue by having projects that promote those tasks and that breaks this gender division. Regarding access to justice, we had some mixed results because, like I said, those committees were resolving conflict, but still women, they wouldn't know where to go if the committees didn't, if they didn't approve the decision of their committee, or if they wouldn't have any other solution beside the chief or their family, they wouldn't know really the mechanism, the legal courts, where to go, or wouldn't have access to them due to financial issues. And finally, the issue of family decision-making processes. Like I said, consultation, where the whole family is being consulted regarding questions of land. This is happening a lot in Sierra Leone. There's a big tradition of having family meetings and discussing together, which is very nice. But still, we are asking the question, how strongly are women involved in those decisions? How strongly will they raise their voice during those meetings? Or is it still the heads of family, the men that are making those decisions? And how could we empower them to raise their voice and transform a bit those decision-making processes? Okay, thank you. Looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing your work there, Yannick. We'll allow some time at the end for people to share questions. So hopefully that raised some questions for you, and we'll present them to Yannick at the end after we've heard from all of our panelists. Now, just before we move on to our next panelist, I just want to remind everybody to click on the interpretation globe icon in Zoom and select English, as we will be using an interpreter for this next panelist. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, in the bottom navigation bar, there should be a globe icon. If you click on that, and please select English, otherwise you won't be able to hear from our next panelist, and we would really like that for you to be able to hear. Okay, now I'm handing the floor over to Gulzat Namatbekova, who's from the Kyrgyz Republic. She'll share her findings on post-Soviet land reforms and women. And we're very interested to hear from you now, Gulzat. Thank you.
Спасибо. Как меня представили, меня зовут Гульзат Наматбекова. Я сама являюсь юристом, специализирующим в земельном законодательстве и в области законодательства, регулирующего сельское хозяйство. Тема моего исследования, которое я выбрала, это было последствия земельно-аграрной реформы на права женщин в домохозяйствах, где главами являются мужчины. Как вы знаете, я хочу чуть-чуть коротко рассказать о своей стране, чтобы понимать контекст, который влияет на саму земельно-аграрную реформу. Кыргызстан в 1998 году провел аграрно-земельную реформу, в процессе которого порядка 75% сельскохозяйственных земель у нас было передано в частную собственность фермеров. Примерно из них половина граждан, это именно женщины, получили эти земельные доли в частную собственность. То есть наше государство признает право частной собственности на сельскохозяйственную землю. Это тоже, можно сказать, один из таких приоритетных, может быть, моментов аграрной земельной реформы, которая присуща именно Кыргызстану по сравнению с другими, например, даже постсоветскими государствами. Вместе с тем, как вы знаете, у нас Кыргызстан является страной, в котором большинство людей мы являемся мусульманами. В то же время глубока наша история в том, что мы являемся тюркским государством, которое проповедует тенгрианство, то есть смешение всех этих культур, иногда даже также повлияло на эту же земельно-аграрную реформу, плюс и на права женщин. Далее, в процессе своей изучения мною были применены такая методология, как анкетирование. С учетом того, что вот было такой глобальный ковид, можно сказать, мы не смогли полноценно, может быть, еще больше охватить численность женщин, которую мы бы хотели бы опросить, но я думаю, что все-таки это исследование показывает, может быть, даже 99% того, что должно быть на самом деле. По методологии я проводила исследование в двух частях нашей страны. Это северная часть страны и южная часть, которая отличается по себе, по ведению аграрного хозяйства и которая также влияет и на владение женщин земельными ресурсами. Южная часть нашей страны обладает особенностью вот то, что очень большая плотность населения, и люди обладают меньшими земельными участками. Северная часть нашего государства, оно отличается более, так скажем, малочисленностью, но при этом люди владеют более большими размерами земельных долей. То есть это тоже в процессе опроса влияло на, так скажем, землевладение прав фермеров, в конечном итоге и самих женщин. Что для меня, так скажем, поразило и в процессе своего исследования, хотя я занимаюсь уже порядка более 16 лет в аграрно-земельной реформе, что это исследование мне дало понять конкретно права женщин на землю в отношении сельскохозяйственных земель, потому что я всегда работала более глобально, в части законодательства, так скажем, не рассматривая контекст гендерного неравенства в этой сфере. И это исследование мне дало возможность именно понять проблематику вот в этом аспекте. Первое. То, что, конечно же, для нас большую роль имеют те традиции и обычаи, которые у нас есть в нашем государстве, в нашем народе. То, что женщины, да, выходя замуж, они оставляют также свои земельные доли своим родителям, своим родственникам. При этом они добровольно и вполне, так скажем, были убеждены в том, что они не должны забирать свои земельные доли при выходе замуж, что это должно остаться ихним родителям. Меня поразило то, что они, понимая, что это является экономическим ресурсом для женщин, были готовы оставить это вот в той семье, в которой они росли. То есть значимость земельного участка как экономического ресурса, наверное, на сегодняшний день не достигла этого уровня. Это вот по сравнению с земельными участками, которые находятся в категории других земель, потому что в Кыргызстане, если женщина говорит о землях, которые являются городскими, здесь женщина подумает, оставить его, так скажем, своим родителям или нет. То есть здесь уже ценность этого земельного участка имеет очень большое значение. Второе. Конечно же, есть и некоторые, так скажем, пробелы в нашем законодательстве, которые отражают на права женщин. То, что, например, женщина уже юридически даже ему тяжело разделить свой земельный участок и получить за него компенсацию, потому что есть очень большие законодательные ограничения и механизмы, которые она должна пройти. И это в конечном счете женщина не хочет этого делать. То есть иногда ее расходы могут быть больше, чем она получит какой-либо доход от этого земельного участка. То есть она вынуждена это оставить. Далее, что бы я хотела бы отметить? Конечно, большой проблемой является то, что сельское хозяйство, оно на сегодняшний день является нерентабельной, и вследствие чего женщины, которые владеют земельными долями сельхозназначения, они не заинтересованы обрабатывать эти земли. То есть у них нет агротехнических каких-то навыков. То есть в процессе реформы даже учителям дали земли, медикам дали, женщинам эти земли. То есть они сегодня профессионально не могут эффективно ими управлять. Далее, и в процессе своего анкетирования я выделила такой очень положительный момент в отношении женщин аграрно-земельной реформы, то, что те женщины, которые владеют земельными участками, они в случае нетрудоспособности могут получить, оказывается, пособие, вне зависимости от того, они работают или нет. Это, можно сказать, очень большое, так скажем, помощь тем женщинам, которые являются многодетными, никогда не работали. То есть эти женщины, которых я опрашивала, они говорили, да, мы видим большой, так скажем, помощь и большое такое положительное влияние, то, что они владеют земельными долями, то, что они могут от государства получить пособие. И в процессе анкетирования, когда я им опять же задавала вопросы, а вот кому вы хотите наследовать эти земли, они почему-то говорили только сыновьям. То есть вот очень много таких противоречивых моментов, когда они сами не осознают вот роль этих земельных участков. И опять же я спрашиваю, а вы хотите, чтобы ваши дочери тоже получили пособие? Они говорят, ну да, тогда давайте и дочерям тоже поделим. То есть, может быть, даже правовая неграмотность этих женщин не дает им дальше думать об экономической ценности этих земельных участков. И в процессе вот этого анкетирования я постаралась дать им больше, так скажем, может быть, информации о ценности этих земельных участков, поделиться с ними, ответить на какие-то их вопросы. Я надеюсь, что вот процесс какого-то, может быть, кратковременного какого-то консультирования некоторых женщин убедила, что ценности земельного участка, кому они должны наследовать, как они должны их использовать. И что бы я хотела бы, ну, вот это вот как бы один из тех моментов, когда я думаю, что мое вмешательство внесло какой-то вклад в понимание женщин о ценности земель сельскохозяйственного назначения. Но хотелось бы, конечно же, и в своих рекомендациях я отметила, что очень сегодня необходимо, мы говорим, что сегодня больше о гендерных проблемах женщин в отношении социального аспекта, то есть вот в отношении, когда идет насилие женщин, да, социальных каких-то проблем. Я бы сейчас хотела бы, чтобы и больше уделялось внимание в отношении, так скажем, экономических каких-то стабильности, гарантий женщин. То есть у женщины должна быть экономический какой-то инструменты, те же самые земельные участки, какое-то имущество, которое ей даст возможность зарабатывать эти деньги. И одним из моих рекомендаций, конечно же, было это, что сегодня в Кыргызстане нужно сделать очень большой гендерный анализ по экономическим возможностям этих женщин. То есть чем они могут зарабатывать. То есть если даже их обучать какому-либо делу, есть ли у них финансовые, экономические возможности для ее осуществления. Ну и, конечно же, это законодательные проблемы, которые я говорила, что не дают возможность механизма его реализации. Но я думаю, что в процессе, так скажем, работы, вот эти законодательные проблемы, я так как я работаю в сфере земельно-аграрной реформы, я знаю, что эти законодательные вопросы будут уже отменены и есть уже прецеденты. Мой акцент больше, наверное, в отношении того, что сегодня женщин нужно все-таки говорить об экономических возможностях и стабильности этих женщин, обучать их агротехническим навыкам, которые есть, то есть развивать женское предпринимательство, которое им даст возможность развивать эту отрасль, если они, конечно, хотят этим профессионально заниматься и иметь от него какой-либо источник дохода. То есть вот, так скажем, кратко мои исследования, которые я провела. Ну, я что могу отметить? Я могу отметить, что в процессе своей повседневной работы я стараюсь делиться со всеми своими выводами, которые есть на всех своих мероприятиях. Вот последнее у нас была разработка проекта концепции агропромышленного комплекса до 2025 года в Кыргызстане, в процессе которой я тоже подняла эту проблематику, и многие эксперты, государственные органы тоже были согласны с этим выводами, и вы и говорили о том, что да, женское предпринимательство нужно поднимать, вопросы юридической нестыковки, то, что у них есть вопросы того, что то, что мы говорим, непонимание государственных органов, их проблематики, это все нужно решать на высоком государственном уровне. Вот кратко, так скажем, мое исследование.
Thank you very much, Gulzad, for sharing your findings. It was wonderful to hear from you. And you did mention something that I failed to mention in my introductory remarks, and that was that all of you have conducted this research during a very difficult time for many of us during the pandemic. And so I think it was particularly difficult and impressive that all of you were able to complete it in that time. Thank you for mentioning that, and thank you for sharing your findings. And again, I encourage everyone to submit questions at the end of the session for Gulzad and Yannick, and also for Betty Okero from CSO Network in Kenya. Hello, Betty. We'll be giving you the floor in just a minute. Betty and her team were looking at formal and traditional justice systems and how well they work to protect women's rights to land. And they are here today, or Betty's representing her team, to share with us the findings from that study. Thank you very much, Betty.
Thank you very much, Elsa and Kasten, for the support. And I'd like to also say hello to my fellow panelists who are here today, and greetings to everybody who's joined us today. So from Kenya, it's afternoon, and I'd like to just say hamjamboni, wherever you are. So our study that we were looking at, we wanted to try and understand to what extent rulings, whether judicial and non-judicial, have translated into security of tenure for women. And that's because Kenya has gone through massive transformation within the land sector to try and ensure that we are able to have more women access their rights, that it is equitable, and that ownership is smooth and it's predictable as well. And so we used case studies in our research, identified women with land cases who had either used both the formal or the informal structures to document and analyze their experience, which would then be able to determine to what extent the land reform systems we have in Kenya has actually been transformative when it comes to women's enjoyment of their land rights. We also wanted to find out to what extent these reforms fared against patriarchy and the traditional system, because it would demonstrate an understanding that there is a social context that women operate in, and that when we're looking at that context, it plays a massive role in terms of how some of these rulings are actually realized. We also wanted to find out to what extent these rulings are enforceable, because this would provide further proof that the land-related legislative reforms were not just transformative, but that they were actually working for women, because that was their understanding as to why most of those reforms were brought in place. So I'd like to just start by putting this conversation into context, because there is an existing tension in terms of women enjoying their rights when they use either the judicial or the informal system. That exists. However, you also have women who have started the journey through an informal system, made their way all the way to a judicial system, and still have to deal with tensions around ownership and rights. Most women at the community level, most of women start their land challenges at the community level. And they will then make their way, and it's led until they get to a place where they can actually say, I have gotten my justice. But then there are also incidences where at some point for them, just having an affirmation that they're owners is enough. It doesn't necessarily create legitimacy of sort, because they still do not have certain documents that affirm that sort of ownership. When you look at the alternative dispute structures that we have at the community level, they're much more favorable to women. They hold a lot of cultural power. They're therefore guided by norms, and the decisions that they make are sometimes not just powerful in its nature, but also powerful. So if you have a structure that denies women their opportunity for ownership and management, you're actually saying that you've actually put a stop as to how she's able to enjoy those rights. And during our research, we were able to find so many women who, by nature of the fact that the cultural structures use traditional, their traditional power, not favorably against them, then they struggled consistently trying to ensure that they would be able to enjoy those rights. So when you call these meetings, because when it comes to land, the assumption is that the land is owned by the whole family. So it opens up all avenues for using culture, and it can be done both positively or negatively on how women will be able to access the land that is rightfully theirs. So when you go to these meetings, the women would say there are actually conflict resolutions that arbitrate conflict between families. It already puts the woman in a negative position as the family breaker or the home breaker or the community breaker. And so whatever decisions are made over there is supposed to be of communal interest. And that's where you have got cultural structures saying, in as much as we have all these reforms in place, they believe that there's a tension, that the laws that we have in place does not actually recognize and appreciate cultural practices and how those cultural practices were dished out. So that in itself becomes the beginning of a challenge when it comes to enforcing the outcomes. Now, none of these structures are also the same. You have structures where women would be able to present their cases and it would be dealt with according to the existing laws that are in place. So they would apply the land reform laws that are there that address issues around matrimonial acts, property rights, the land ownership, all that is put in place in some of these structures, and women were able to benefit. However, that does not in itself translate to enjoyment, because then she has got to be able to find out how she will affirm her right. The fact that she has gone forward to question and to demand for that right has created its own conflict between herself and the family. So customary laws will recognize the right to inherit. It recognizes, how to manage and dispose of property, but under a communal system. And the issue of land inheritance by women traditionally did not exist because land belonged to the family. it belonged to the community. And this is where you start having the sort of tensions and conflicts in terms of enforcement of some of these rulings that come out in favor of women. So you have a formal and informal system that Kenya recognizes to be able to deal with land issues. However, the same customary norms around land rights can also be allocated according to gender, according to the social values, according to your status, according to your economic status or your marital status, which means you can also be denied, you can be dispossessed, or you can have the land protected. It actually depends sometimes on where you are in the economic status. In other words, the system is as robust as the duty bearer's own norms and beliefs. The awareness of the framework, the legal framework that exists around women and property, and the application of this framework, and willingness to uphold and support women's tenure without looking at all those different nuances that sometimes come into play to determine whether they will be able to enjoy those rights or not. So if you then start challenging those rights at that particular level, if it's about gender, and you then find that you have girls in the study who had been given land by their mothers, and it became so difficult for them to be able to start getting the documents to affirm that ownership because they were girls. Whereas she is given this same land, her brother was given an equal portion. Nothing at all was asked about the brother. So we start looking at her gender to determine whether she has rights. So her study revealed that there's no guarantee of enforcing these rights, no matter the route that you take, whether it's formal or informal, because even when you go through a judicial process and the court affirms your ownership, you still, as a woman, have got to go back and then demand that that affirmation is recognized. But because of the cultural challenges or the cultural issues within that community and that family, it means that it's not possible to enforce it. And this lack of enforcement creates a powerlessness, because then it renders any positive ruling that is given just that, just a ruling. But we have so many women in the study who said they took solace in the fact that there was a pronouncement, but then they wondered what would happen to their children after they're gone, and whether they'd have to go through the whole process again. So resolutions that are made both at formal or informal structure in support of women, they leave women with a responsibility of enforcing these rights. It does not take into consideration women's position in the patriarchal structure. It doesn't acknowledge the conflict that it creates within the family by the fact that she was pursuing her rights. It doesn't acknowledge, therefore, that she's considered a pariah. And if these rulings do not make those rights accessible because they are not enforceable, then it means that we're saying that it actually doesn't translate into enjoyment of these rights. Because enforcement is not just about giving a ruling in favor or an acknowledgement. It must be extended to include the enjoyment, the robust nature of using that land, the power to have decisions around it, the power to use the land in whatever way it is, the power for her to even have, to bequeath it to the next generation. So despite the presence of these laws protecting women's land rights, ownership, and this is the thing, because most of these women earn their rights, just as Yannick has said, through marriage. So the protection that we have in the law also is through marriage. And it was set up in such a way that because somebody is married, then should anything happen to her spouse, she was an automatic owner. When you question that marriage, because she doesn't have a son, or she only has daughters, or she is number 3 in the polygamous setup, once you start questioning those rights, then you're actually starting to say that the women do not deserve the land rights that they're claiming. Our study went further and then recognized the paradox of title deeds. The assumption that title deeds carries,
Hello, Betty. It's Kirsten here. Your screen has frozen and we no longer have audio with you. Elisa, we might need to...
Betsy, are you there? Oh, hi. We just lost you when you were getting to the interesting part. You're on mute now, if you could unmute.
Sorry, where had I reached? Where did you lose me?
You just started talking about title deeds and the paradox.
Okay. Yes. So I was talking about how title deeds were presented as the panacea of legitimacy, that once we have this document, that it becomes easier for women to be able to secure their tenure because they have legal rights. Unfortunately, the documentation process around land is predominantly
Betty, if you can hear me, we've lost you again. Betty? No, we seem to have lost connection with Betty.
I'm sorry that I'm going through a difficult patch with our internet. I'm hoping that it's going to behave for the next 5 or so.
That's okay.
So we found in our studies so many women who are struggling to get title deeds. They did not want their children to have to go through what they did. And they wanted to be able to be acknowledged as a rightful owner. Yes, the title deed makes it easier to prove ownership and legitimacy through the judicial process, but it does not actually translate to having control on even enjoyment of these rights as an owner. There was a woman we talked to who said that they weren't able to give her the rights to her land because she was a woman. They said that they would hold the land in trust for her son who was 5 years old, did not trust her to be able to have the ability to manage that land on behalf of her own kids. So when you have institutions with structures that believe that land laws are in conflict with their culture, then they will not participate in enforcing the outcomes of cases in support of women, as we have seen in a lot of these structural, traditional structures that we have. Accessing documents that validate your ownership is such a tedious process because it is patriarchal. And once you have a patriarchy who is 4 or 5 generations removed, the process of trying to change that land into the person who then becomes the administrator may be the same person who's actually trying to take your right to that land away. The informal process that we're talking about is favored by many, but it is also fraught with so much unpredictability. And most of this is caused by either your cultural practice or the belief or the attitudes, a lack of knowledge on the land reform, or simply just a denial to allow women to be able to enjoy their land. The laws that we have in place affirms that if a woman is dispossessed of her land and she can prove that it is hers, then it will affirm that ownership. But that pronouncement is not enough. It isn't enough for her to be able to inherit her land. It is not enough for her to be able to have that land bequeathed to her. And so this pronouncement will not necessarily translate into ownership status. As long as the interest and the power residing in the elders and the larger family and the males within the home continue to be the one that's listened to, then they will continue to render this pronouncement, whether it's in a formal structure or an informal one, this pronouncement will continue to be meaningless. So we have reformed land laws but we have left cultural structures and their extra-legal norms intact. And when I say extra-legal norms, I'm talking about the processes that women have to go, the intimidations they have to go through, the violence that they have got to go through, the proof that they have to show that they were married when it was just a traditional setup. The fact that you're being told that you also do not have a child. There are so many other layers that play a role that determine the extent to which women can actually be able to enjoy the land. So the study clearly showed that it is not enough to just be recognized as a beneficiary. And also that just reforming the lands that have an impact of women's land rights is not enough. It does not in any way guarantee security, because there are other formalization process where the battle is, which is considered the next stage for her to be able to enjoy these rights. In these spaces, she does not have a say. Somebody else has it. So what is becoming evident is the legal framework that is pro-women is good, but it works alongside an entrenched male-dominated and patriarchal land management system. And this continues to present barriers and affects women's ability and potential to own, to access, to control. It creates the bar for her to be able to produce the evidence so high, particularly in this informal structures that they like, that they find much more better because it reduces, the presence of conflict. And women's land rights will remain insecure even with the presence of this legal protection. The backwards of land laws that Kenya has, that we're talking about, is easier for women to access land rights. It is assumed that therefore it should be easier for them to access these rights in both formal and informal. However, we must be able to deal with other aspects as well. And culture plays a very, very big role, and it continues to hinder women's realization to their rights. And so for us, one of the recommendations that we gave was, it is important that judicial rulings must clearly state the next steps. It's not enough to just affirm. We find that courts are able to, when they're talking about civil litigation and conveyancing, they actually say, and we organize for the police to be present when you are going to enjoy or reclaim or do that. Similar next steps must be followed. When women go before the courts, it is important that the judges rule, apart from affirmation, but be able to give steps in which women can actually enforce those rulings, and even give set timeframes. In the event that that is not done, the court should continue to be her refuge. It is also important for us to recognize that these informal structures, they don't operate the same. There is need to establish a sort of guideline that is able to determine how they operate, because the lack of, clarity means that women go in there not knowing whether they are going to be given an opportunity to talk, not knowing what it is that they have to do to prepare. They sometimes do not even have minutes to show that there was actually a meeting, and they're stuck trying to prove that there was a meeting. And because some of these structures are run by, people who represent the state, but are also family members, it then creates its own challenges in terms of who this particular individual is going to favor. Finally, we have seen, and even when we were doing our case study, that even when the women went up to court and the court affirmed in front of their family and told the family, this is her land and therefore she has rights. When the woman goes back and she is in front of the family, she's asked, we want to see how you're going to enforce it. And on account of just that statement, we had women who just said, I'm happy that the court has recognized me. I am okay and I will stay, and I do not need to fight because at least I have a roof over my head. But for us, we are saying that the land reforms that we put in place was not just about security. It was about access. It was about control. It was about management. And this study has certainly proved that it is not enough to just have those laws in place. We need to go an extra mile. We need to be able to strengthen the security of tenure. So we are talking about justice, and the right to access and enjoyment of this other bundle of rights that are so important. But we also need to put in place a system that recognizes the role that culture plays against women and be able to make certain rulings that will hold people who refuse to enforce those rulings, hold them accountable, including even arrest them if that needs to be the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Betty. Very good to hear from you and about your findings in your work there in Kenya. One thing that I heard from each of you is that it's actually not just one thing, not one intervention, not one change, not one project that's going to bring about the kind of change that might be needed to really see a long-term difference in women's lives. And so I'm gonna start off the question section now and put it to all of you. You can choose who of you would like to answer. I'm just wondering, did your research kind of yield any insights into what else can be done, right? You looked at a specific intervention, you looked at a specific law, you looked at a specific reform, and you saw some changes, but you also saw the need for other things. But I'm wondering what your insights were into the things beyond that that might be needed to kind of see the results that you would hope for. Do one of you want to take a stab at answering the first question? Or I'll call on someone. Betty, do you want to take a stab at answering my question? Oops.
Sorry, can you please ask you again? Because I lost you a little bit.
Sorry. So my question was, I noticed that across all of the studies, there was this kind of common thread that it was never going to be, just one thing that would address the kind of the slew of needs that women might have, and that you might see some changes that come from one intervention or one legal reform. You might see some incremental change. I was wondering if your research gave you any insight into specific things that could be done that would help kind of address some of those more deeply entrenched customs or cultural attitudes, or even economic interests, that might be there that attached to land, so that interventions could be designed in a more broad, or in a way that kind of addressed those bigger questions.
Yes, well, one of the things that came up very clearly for us is that the women's, option for going to this community structures, we need to then be able to ask ourselves whether we just want to have traditional, leaders only, or we want to expand it. I think for me, it is important because the Kenya Constitution says that any law that is in conflict with the Constitution becomes null and void. So if we have got laws in place that says they recognize women as rightful owners of their husband's property, whether it's through divorce or in the event of death, that's a law. The cultural structures that cannot come around and start saying, oh, that's okay, but we know you're married, but if you're going to access this, then you have to get married again. The law doesn't recognize that other second marriage. These other hurdles that are put in place are not necessary. However, I think that it is important for us to be able to put in place community structures that are expanded. And I think Yannick mentioned something about what was going on in Sierra Leone, that you have structures that have got perhaps even paralegal. You've got court mediators in these particular structures, because then it is important that when people actually present themselves in these structures, they then adhere to the law of the land. And the law of the land is more supreme than the cultural practice that exists. And I think also it's important that I said that culture is used both negatively and positively. Not every single statement that is given, claiming that this is culture is actually culture. Some of it was really just theft. I mean, that's my take, because this is your brother-in-law's wife. But then you turn around and say, can you prove? They've been living together for 10 years. That's not culture. That's just trying to steal somebody else's land. But it then becomes easier because there is nobody else over there who is standing on behalf of the woman. And I think that is where we need to be able to strengthen, that if women are going to go and present themselves in these structural committees and community structures, they then must be accompanied with either a legal person or a human rights defender or somebody else, or even somebody who is representing the state, because the state is supposed to represent the interest of the community members that are present and ensure that the process that's being followed is adhering to the prescribed law that exists.
Yeah. Thanks, Betty. I'll read out a couple of questions that came in from the chat that are directed to specific panelists. There's one that came in the chat that's for
можно я тоже чуть-чуть добавлю?
There's one there that says family land plots to be subdivided into shares so that women can take out their share when they marry and divorce in Kyrgyzstan. So that is, they can leave their household with the land plot. Have there been many cases in the Kyrgyz Republic when women took out their land share from the household plot that you came across? Thank you.
Спасибо за вопрос. Я бы чуть-чуть хотела бы тоже дополнить к вашему первому вопросу, если можно будет. Я вот когда... О. Да. Да. Угу. Если возможно, я хотела чуть-чуть добавить вот к вашему первому вопросу. Да? Я вот даже в процессе исследования я это написала. Очень большой проблемой аграрно-земельной реформы не только в нашем государстве, в других, то, что мы хотели сделать социальную справедливость и разделить всем земли, является это раздробленность земельных участков сельскохозяйственного назначения. Сегодня эта женщина, которая, если даже выделит какой-то 1 соток своей земли, обрабатывать его нерентабельно. То есть насколько этой женщине нужен 1 соток земли. Поэтому сегодня стоит очень большой глобальный вопрос, это консолидация земель сельскохозяйственного назначения для того, чтобы его эффективно использовать. И я думаю, что решение этого вопроса очень повлияет на тоже решение вопросов женщин, прав на землю. Вопросы, те же самые вызовы, новые вызовы климатическим условиям, изменениям, которые тоже должны быть решены, когда будет говорим о женских, скажем, правах женщин. И принятие инноваций в сельском хозяйстве, конечно, тоже решат проблемы женщин. Что касается вопроса, который мне задали, да, вот в процессе земельно-аграрной реформы я не отметила, нашим женщинам тоже давали земельные доли в рамках семьи. То есть это были муж, может быть, родители, дети и так далее, да. И в процессе далее, когда была необходимость его делить, женщины сталкивались с этими проблемами. Что касается законодательства, законодательство есть, оно регулирует процесс его деления. Но сам вопрос его деления сопутствует для женщин очень большими проблемами, как касается финансовыми, так и знания правовых норм при его делении. И вот в этом вопросе уже женщина сталкивается с этим, хочет этого делать. Это для нее становится очень трудной обузой. И вот опять же следствие того, если даже она поделит этот, так скажем, свою долю, маленькую долю, она его не сможет использовать. То есть она может говорить только об экономической, денежной его компенсации, которая тоже не всегда решается. Есть случаи получения денежной компенсации женщинами своих земельных долей, когда они разводились, уходили из своих семей. То есть есть такие случаи. Есть у нас еще на сегодняшний день такая законодательная проблема, то, что земельный участок, который меньше 5 гектаров, он не может быть разделен. Это тоже поставило на сегодняшний момент женщин к тому, что они не могут юридически его поделить. В своей исследовании было мною описано, что есть решение Верховного суда Кыргызской Республики, которое признала эту норму неконституционной. То есть оно ущемляет права не только женщин, но и других членов этого земельного участка. То есть сегодня у нас есть проблемы законодательства, которые ущемляют и противоречат Конституции, но в то же время хотят решить какую-то проблему аграрно-земельной реформы. То есть вот нахождение, вот так скажем, какой-то золотой середины в этой проблеме, я думаю, это дальнейшая наша работа. Но я хочу отметить, что юридически это возможно, механизмы все расписаны, но сам путь для женщин очень тяжелый.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a question in the chat for Yannick. It's specific to the bylaws, the customary bylaws that you referenced. The question is, who decided to enact the customary bylaws and why? And is that part of the written formal law?
Thank you. Well, I'll not lie to you, those bylaws, they were suggested by the projects. So around all this awareness raising that was down to show how beneficial those customary rights promoting women's access to land can be. At the same time, it was suggested that those community would enforce those bylaws. But of course, it was done in agreement with the traditional leaders and then with those land committee that were formed and that would enforce those bylaws on behalf of the community instead of the traditional leaders. So what's done in consultation afterwards with the whole communities after those awareness training, and the people agreed to it. But yes, it was suggested by the local NGOs that were implementing the project.
Yeah, thank you. And then another question here for Betty in the Q&A panel. The question reads, are women able to sit in dispute resolution panels, at least the customary one at the grassroots in your study area?
Yes, actually, I was amazed at how women were so resilient when it comes to issues around ownership. They actually are the ones who initiated the process. And along the way, they had to learn. It was almost like they were learning on the job as they were pursuing their rights. So they would then be able to make the initial visits, and then the family is then called. And if it wasn't, if the response was not in her favor, she then elevated it to the next level. And we had women going from one stage to another, pursuing those particular interests. And it was interesting how they never gave up. And the reason why was because they believed and they knew that they had a right, and they were simply protecting that right. And that those rights were guaranteed by the fact that they know that they were members of that family. And I think I just want to perhaps just add one more thing. I think that because the structures are there, we are not going to run away from them. We need to find out how they can work for women. And I think we need to be able to promote certain things that when women then go into homes as they just get married, they're actually shown this is going to be your kitchen. We need to find out how we actually have witnesses who are present when you are arriving for the first time, whether that witness is a member of your family, whether it's friends who are there, but something that's put in place and it's written, because I think it is important. We also must encourage our respective spouses to put in place wills, to be able to say, this is my wife and I married her, and have somebody affirm that, witnesses present, so that women don't have to struggle to be able to prove that they are the wife, or you then have people trying to prove that these are actually the children. I also note that there was one person who asked how they can enforce their land rights, and this is somebody from Kenya. And I'd like to say our constitution is the most progressive. And just the other day, one of the things that came out clearly is the need to be able to use the Bill of Rights, which is the economic, social, cultural rights, to be able to use that to push your rights is very, very important, because the state has a duty and responsibility, and they can't just get away. And if communities can prove that they were owners, and they have always been, because it recognizes our culture, then they can be able to use that as a platform to be able to push and demand for their land rights. Sorry, and there was somebody who asked about the title. It is a difficult process. To be able to get a title, if a woman is going to be able to pursue her title, they first have got to be able to find out who is going to be the administrator. And it means that you then have got to get every single person in the family coming together to agree that you actually want to divide the land. It is at the point of dividing this land that women end up having almost sometimes nothing. They're comfortable and they will compromise. So it is not easy. And when it is coming from the wife or your daughter, your sister-in-law, then the question is, as who? Why should we do that for you? So it isn't easy. It all depends. But I think that when you then have bylaws in place, like what Yannick is talking about, but I think it's bylaws that recognizes some sort of cultural aspects of how land is going to be managed, it will be easy for the process of succession and administration to be able to take place.
Thank you, Betty. And I think you just answered another question that was in there, so I can for you around adopting bylaws and whether that would be useful in your setting as well. I have, go ahead, Yannick. Yes, if you want to add to that.
Just address this because I think that's quite interesting. And while the process that is happening in Sierra Leone can be very useful to adopt those bylaws and try through the customs to improve those women's rights, I think the process that Betty is describing is at the same time very important and should happen, because what is happening in our communities, in the communities in Sierra Leone, is that the people, the women, they still want to have access to justice in case they're still at the mercy of those traditional systems, even if those traditional systems might be more open, might accept inheritance to women of those household plots, etc. If a decision is made that they don't agree with, they don't have any place to go. This is also what we found. They don't know. They would sometimes mention some human rights organizations, civil society, but that's it. The whole formal legal system, they wouldn't know where to go and they wouldn't have access to it. So I would say that would be also parallel to have those institutions of paralegals or CSO or the states supporting those women in case that they have grievances against those decisions, of course.
And it seems to me that actually it links up with what I think a number of you said earlier in your presentations, which is that there needs to be a number of different supplementary things taking, at the same time, that there's not going to be just one single intervention or one single change that's going to be sufficient to protect those bundle of rights that are kind of at stake with for women. Here's another question for Gulzat. The question is, how is land inheritance achieved in Kyrgyzstan for a family that is blessed with only daughters?
Да, я слышу, ага. Ну, если, конечно, дочь, единственная дочь, то остается дочери. Поэтому в этом отношении, чтобы отдать там родственнику, который является по мужской линии, в кыргызских традициях такого нету. То есть если единственным наследником является женщина, то она и будет ее наследовать.
Okay, thank you, Gulzat. And I think we have time for one last question here. This is a question, I would like to find out from Betty the extent to which non-traditional institutions, like the formal state institutions in Kenya, are able and willing to enforce and uphold court rulings in favor of marginalized people, for example, the Ogiek.
It is not easy, and the Ogiek is a large community, but it hasn't been easy. Enforcement is actually left to the person who has then been the community that has been pursuing. For the community of the Ogiek, it's actually them versus the state. And so they're trying to see how they can enforce their rights against the state that is the perpetrator, so to speak, in this particular instance. And it becomes difficult because then when you're suing the state's machinery are not going to come in against the state. And therefore the Ogiek community are left in limbo that they may have a ruling that is in their favor, but they're unable to be able to enforce that ruling because you're not sure who you're going to give it to. So even if you were to go to the community and start, wanting to create your new residential place, so to speak, you will have the same state coming in here and then telling you that we are giving you notice to be able to vacate, and using whatever it is, whatever excuses it is that they're going to use. And also the state is not talking to each other. And it's all very, very deliberate. Now, if you take that to the community level, you also then have the state that is not listening. And it could be because of a number of things. Some of it is status related. Some of it is because the person you're asking to enforce the ruling is sometimes even your brother-in-law. And that becomes almost impossible and difficult. I think that there has got to be a way, and for both the Ogiek and women generally, that we have to find out how both the judicial process and the informal structure must enforce rulings and outcomes. There has got to be a way in which it isn't that because this is from the court, then only the court will enforce it. No, we have to find out how all these institutions can work together, because then it goes towards the recognition of this person's rights, and it becomes a little bit more easier. But for the Ogiek community, it has been a battle, and I really don't have anything else to say, because I do recognize that they're up against the state that has the resources, that has every single arsenal at their disposal to do whatever it is that they wish to be able to do. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Betty. I think we're a little bit over time already, so I think we'll have to wrap it up now. I'd just like to say thank you to our panelists for sharing their insights and their findings with us today. It's been really great to hear from you all, and lovely to see you all again after some time. And also thank you to everyone who attended and participated and shared their good questions for the panel today. We'd like to remind you that the webinar has been recorded. If any of you, and you'll all be sent a link to the recording if you'd like to see it again. The links to the papers are available both in the chat here, and they'll be part of the recording. And if you have any questions at all for the panelists, I'm sure they'd be willing to speak with you afterwards. We can put you in contact with them. And if you have any questions for us at Resource Equity, you're welcome to reach out to us as well. We thank you all very much for your time and your continued commitment and interest in women's land tenure security, because it's a really important issue. And as we know, there's not that much being done on it and not enough attention to these issues. So thank you very much to all of you for your commitment and your attention. And I wish you all a good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. I'll be going to bed now. Okay, thank you all very much. It was lovely to see you. Bye-bye.